My name is Natalie Green. I'm 29 and 3 days after my MBA graduation. I learned my grandfather had left me a $1 million estate. I should have been celebrating, but all I could think about was how quickly my family would try to claim it if they found out. They had spent my whole life favoring my younger sister, leaving me to fend for myself, and I knew exactly how this story would go if I stayed unprepared. So I made a choice they could never undo. I moved every dollar, every deed, every record into a trust under a name they didn't know, locked away 3 hours north in a place they would never think to look. I told no one. But secrets have a way of making noise, and soon the knocks came at my door, first with fake papers, then with lawyers, then with whispers meant to ruin me in my own town. They turned neighbors into enemies, called my boss with lies, and dragged my name into rooms I had never walked into. I had the evidence to destroy their schemes, but using it meant exposing just how far I'd gone to protect what was mine. What would you do if the people you share blood with decided they were entitled to everything you've built, and how far would you go to make sure they never touch it? Stay with me, because this fight was only getting started. It all began on a sunny June afternoon, the day I walked across that stage. I can still feel the warmth on my face and the heavy gown swaying around my ankles, the cheers of strangers filling the air. Somewhere in that blur of celebration, my phone buzzed with a name I recognized instantly: Samuel Pierce, my grandfather's attorney. His voice was steady, but the words he spoke cut through everything around me. The estate had been processed. Everything was mine. $1 million, the Harborview House's investments. I stood apart from the crowd, the sound of my classmates fading, and felt the weight of it settle in my chest. Not because of the number, but because of what it meant. I could see him again in my mind, standing on the porch with the wind off the Pacific pulling at his coat, his hands worn from years at sea. He used to tell me, you have to know what's worth keeping and how to protect it. No one else will do it for you. At 16, I didn't understand, but I do now. The drive back to my apartment in Seattle was short, but my thoughts ran miles ahead, revisiting all the moments that taught me exactly how my family worked. Sophie's first car bought without question, the whimsical trip to New York funded without a blink, the Portland condo gifted under the guise of an investment. I had been told over and over that she had potential to be helped while I was capable of managing on my own. I know now that meant she deserved more, and I would be fine with less. I pulled into the underground garage of my building, parked, and sat there with the engine off, hands still on the steering wheel. The image of the Harborview House rose in my mind, its weathered red siding and wide porch facing the ocean. That house wasn't just property. It was summer mornings with the smell of my grandmother's coffee drifting through the kitchen. It was the creak of the wooden stairs at night, the sound of rain on the metal roof. It was where my grandfather taught me how to steer his boat through the harbor channel and how to tie a bowline knot with my eyes closed. And now it was mine. Legally. Entirely. For as long as I could keep it safe. Upstairs in my apartment, I took off the gown and draped it over a chair. The diploma went on the kitchen table, still in its leather case. I made tea and stood by the window looking out at the city skyline, thinking about what would come next. There was no question in my mind that the moment my parents or Sophie found out, the conversations would start. Suggestions about shared ownership, offers to help manage the property, maybe even a story about how my grandfather had intended it for everyone. I knew the patterns too well. If I wanted to honor him, I had to make sure no one could touch it. The tea grew cold in my hand as the decision took shape. I wouldn't tell them. Not now, maybe not ever. I would meet with Samuel Pierce, get every detail in writing, and start moving the pieces into place before they even realized there was a game being played. I thought again of my grandfather's voice on the porch, the firm way he said, "No one else will do it for you." He was right. This was mine to protect, and I would. I called my parents that evening out of habit more than anything else. The conversation was short, just enough to check the box. Helen asked if the ceremony had gone well, her voice light and distracted the way it always was when she had one eye on something else. Charles's voice came from somewhere in the background, muffled, like he was walking past the phone rather than actually taking part. Sophie was the only one who sounded energetic, asking if I'd taken photos and posting a few to the family group chat for her to see. I told them I was tired from the day and needed to rest. When I hung up, I stared at the phone for a while, knowing that call was a perfect snapshot of our dynamic. My parents had been in that same modest clapboard house in Harborview for over 30 years. My father Charles owned the hardware store on Main Street, the kind of place with creaky floors and hand-painted signs that smelled faintly of cedar and machine oil. My mother Helen ran the reference desk at the town library, shushing noisy teenagers with the same efficiency she used to cut short, uncomfortable family conversations. And then there was Sophie, 3 years younger than me, their golden girl. I don't think they even realized how obvious it was, or maybe they did and simply didn't care. Growing up, I learned quickly that Sophie's wants were treated as needs and my needs were treated as lessons. When Sophie wanted to join the private dance academy, the tuition check was written that same week. When I asked about violin lessons, I was told to see if the public school program had any openings. When Sophie decided she wanted to spend a summer in France to improve her French, they bought her a round-trip ticket and gave her a generous spending allowance. When I mentioned an internship opportunity in Chicago, they said it would be better for me to work locally and save money. One memory in particular stood out as I rinsed out my teacup and set it in the sink. My college graduation. I had been the first in our family to earn a bachelor's degree. The ceremony started at 9 in the morning. By the time I lined up with my classmates in our black gowns, my parents still hadn't arrived. I kept scanning the rows of seats, willing them to appear. They finally slipped in nearly an hour late, right as my row was standing to cross the stage. Afterward, when I asked what had happened, Helen smiled like it was nothing. Sophie had a last-minute performance costume fitting that morning, and they didn't want her to miss it. They stayed for a few quick photos, handed me a card, and left before the end of the ceremony. The card had a $50 bill inside. I spent it on gas to get back to my summer job. It wasn't that I expected them to change. By the time Sophie was in high school, I'd accepted that my role in the family was to manage on my own. If I wanted something, I would have to earn it. If I failed, I would have to fix it myself. Charles framed it as building character. Helen framed it as preparing me for the real world. Sophie never had to hear those speeches. The phone buzzed again, a text from Sophie. She had sent a photo of herself holding a bouquet of flowers captioned with "Hope you had a good day." It was the kind of surface-level niceness she excelled at, the type that photographed well for social media but never carried into anything more substantial. I typed back thanks and left it at that. I could already imagine what her reaction would be if she found out about the inheritance. Wide-eyed surprise at first, then questions about how much, then suggestions about what I could do with it that somehow involved her. The thought made my stomach tighten. The truth was, my parents had a pattern. Anytime something valuable appeared within reach, they found a way to steer it toward Sophie. It could be as blatant as signing over the title of a used car, or as subtle as convincing a relative to leave her an heirloom instead of splitting it evenly. They didn't frame it as favoritism. They called it fairness or family support or practical decision-making. But the result was always the same. Sophie gained, and I learned to make do without. After dinner, I found myself pulling out an old photo album from the bottom of my closet. The first page held a picture of me on my first day of kindergarten, clutching a lunchbox, my hair in uneven pigtails. Sophie wasn't even born yet. The next pages were a mix of birthdays, holidays, and school events, but as the years went on, I was in fewer and fewer photos. Sophie's dance recitals, Sophie's school trips, Sophie at the county fair with a blue ribbon for something I couldn't remember. I traced my finger over the images, not because I wanted to relive them, but because they reminded me exactly why my decision to keep quiet was the right one. I thought about calling my grandfather's attorney the next morning to set up a meeting, but I knew I needed a clear head first. I couldn't let emotion dictate how I moved forward. If I was going to protect what he left me, it would require more than just secrecy. It would require planning, precision, and patience. My family thrived on catching people off guard, on moving quickly before anyone had time to respond. This time I intended to be ahead of them. Outside, the city was settling into night. The glow of street lamps reflected off wet pavement from a brief evening shower. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked and a car door slammed. I sat by the window watching the lights flicker in other people's apartments, wondering if any of them had their own small wars to fight within their families. The thought didn't bring comfort, but it did remind me I wasn't alone in navigating this kind of terrain. By the time I closed the album and slid it back into the closet, I had no doubt left. If they found out, they would come for it. Not out of malice, at least not in their minds, but out of a belief that they were entitled to it. And in their version of the story, I would be selfish for saying no. I knew exactly how that script played out. I had lived it too many times before. This time I would rewrite it. The next morning I called Samuel Pierce and told him I wanted a referral to someone who specialized in real estate and asset protection. He didn't hesitate. Within an hour, I had an appointment with Daniel Brooks, a well-regarded attorney in Seattle who handled high-value estates and had a reputation for being meticulous. I booked a train ticket that afternoon. I didn't want to risk driving my own car and having my parents see it parked somewhere they might question. Seattle was overcast when I arrived, the kind of gray that blurred the edges of the buildings. Daniel's office was in a renovated brick building near Pioneer Square. Inside, the air smelled faintly of leather and old books, the walls lined with framed certificates and photographs of sailboats. He shook my hand firmly and gestured for me to sit at a polished mahogany table that looked like it could outlive both of us. I laid it out for him plainly. I told him about my grandfather's estate, the approximate value, my strained relationship with my family, and my concern that they would try to claim some part of it if they knew it existed. Daniel listened without interrupting, his expression calm but focused, jotting a few notes on a legal pad. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "You're right to act quickly," he said. "Inheritances that are poorly protected can be vulnerable to claims even from family. What I recommend is creating an irrevocable trust which will own the assets, not you personally. Once the assets are in the trust, they can't be seized, reassigned, or altered without the trustee's approval, and we can appoint a corporate trustee to avoid personal conflicts." He outlined the plan step by step. First, we would set up a limited liability company based in Seattle with the trust as its sole owner. The LLC would hold the deed to my grandfather's house, any land and physical assets. Second, we would transfer all investment accounts into the name of the trust, moving them to a bank outside Washington state for an extra layer of separation. Third, we would draft clear trust instructions that ensured only I had beneficial access to the assets, but without my name appearing on public records in connection to them. I asked about cost, about the timeline, about whether this would look suspicious if someone went digging. Daniel smiled slightly. "It will look boring," he said. "That's the goal. A small LLC owning property is not unusual. A trust holding investments is not unusual. And we'll keep all physical documentation locked in my office's secure vault. No one will connect this to you without a court order, and even then they'd need a very good reason." The trust paperwork was dense, filled with legal language that made my head ache, but Daniel walked me through each section until I understood. The irrevocable nature of it meant that once I signed, there was no changing my mind about moving the assets out of my name. That was the point. The separation had to be complete. We spent hours reviewing property records, account statements, and inventory lists from my grandfather's estate. Daniel highlighted items that could be transferred immediately and flagged a few that would need appraisals. He was efficient but careful, making sure no detail slipped through. When he spoke, I could tell he had seen situations like mine before, maybe not with the exact same family dynamics, but close enough to know where the traps were. In the afternoon, a notary came in, a quiet woman in a navy blazer who set out a small stack of documents and guided me through signing them. With each signature, I felt a strange mix of relief and finality, as if I were quietly building a wall that no one else could see, but that would be impossible to climb once it was finished. Daniel slid the last document into a fireproof envelope and wrote the date on the front. "This will go into our secure vault," he said. "Only I and my senior partner have keys. If something happens to me, the instructions for you are in a sealed file. You'll get a copy, but I suggest keeping it somewhere your family has no access to." I promised him I would. I imagined the trust documents resting in some deep metal drawer beneath layers of other clients' files, anonymous and untouchable. The thought was like a weight lifting off my chest. Before I left, Daniel handed me a single sheet with the LLC's registration details and a list of the accounts where the assets would be transferred. He reminded me not to use my personal email for any correspondence related to the trust. From now on, I would use a secure encrypted account he had set up for me. As I stepped back out into the Seattle drizzle, I slipped the folder into my bag and pulled my coat tighter. The streets were busy with people rushing past, umbrellas colliding, no one paying me any mind. I liked it that way. On the train ride home, I kept my hand on the bag, feeling the reassuring weight of the documents. It wasn't just paper, it was a barrier. It was proof that I could act decisively, that I could choose my own security over their approval. By the time I reached my apartment, the city lights reflecting off the wet pavement outside, I knew the line had been drawn. Whatever came next, the estate was no longer within their reach. It was as if I had shut a steel door and turned the lock from my side, leaving them in a world where they could wonder and suspect but never touch. The first Saturday after everything was finalized, I drove to Harborview like I always had, the familiar curve of the coastal highway opening into that wide stretch of water and cedar-lined hills. The house looked the same from the outside, weathered white paint and a wraparound porch that sagged just enough to remind you it had been there for decades. I parked in the gravel drive, letting the engine idle for a moment before I stepped out, breathing in the salt air. Inside, the rooms held the same mix of scents. They always had a faint trace of my grandfather's aftershave lingering in the wood, the mustiness of old books stacked in the den. I dropped my overnight bag in the upstairs bedroom and headed straight for the backyard. The garden was still in late summer bloom, marigolds and lavender framing the path, tomato vines leaning under their own weight. I pulled on gloves and began weeding, the repetitive motion steadying my thoughts. Part of me worried someone might notice something different in my behavior, but I had learned long ago that the surest way to deflect suspicion was to make everything look exactly the same. So, I did the same chores my grandfather had taught me: pruned the rose bushes, scrubbed the porch steps, even fixed a loose shutter on the backside of the house that no one but me would see. Around mid-morning, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Sophie's little silver SUV rolled in, the same one she used to show off on Instagram with captions about weekend escapes. She climbed out with a coffee cup in hand and a too bright smile. "I didn't expect to see you here," I said, standing and brushing soil from my gloves. She shrugged, glancing toward the house. "Thought I'd check in, see how you're doing after graduation." We went inside and she followed me into the kitchen. She sat at the counter, eyes scanning the walls and shelves as if she were cataloging things in her head. I busied myself rinsing herbs in the sink. "So what happens with this place now that Grandpa's gone?" she asked casually, though the way she tilted her head made it feel anything but casual. I kept my voice even. "For now, I'm just keeping it up. The yard, the house, all the usual stuff." She tapped her nails on the counter. "Any idea about paperwork, deeds, and all that?" I turned off the faucet and looked at her just long enough to make her shift slightly in her seat. Daniel's voice echoed in my mind, reminding me that the less said the better. "I'm handling it," I said simply, and then I asked about her new job at the boutique, steering the conversation somewhere safer. Sophie stayed for an hour, sipping her coffee and making small talk, but every few minutes her gaze wandered, landing on the desk in the den, the locked cabinet in the hall, the framed photos in the living room. By the time she left, I could feel the prickle of unease along my spine. She was fishing. The following weekends played out much the same. I would arrive early, mow the lawn, touch up peeling paint on the porch rail, sweep the walkway. Some weekends Sophie would drop by with an excuse, bringing muffins or a bag of fresh fruit, always with that undercurrent of curiosity. Once she asked if I needed help cleaning out the upstairs office. Another time she mentioned she had a friend who could give me a good price if I ever thought of selling. Each time I smiled and gave her nothing. If anything, I made a point of acting distracted, letting her believe the house and I were just drifting along together unchanged. I left the old family photos in their frames, the same knickknacks on the shelves, even kept a few unpaid utility bills in the kitchen drawer to make it look like things were moving at their own slow pace. It wasn't that I enjoyed deceiving her. It was that I knew the cost of being open in this family. If Sophie found even the smallest thread, she would tug until the whole thing unraveled. And behind her, my parents would be waiting, not out of cruelty, but with the conviction that whatever belonged to me should somehow also belong to them. One Sunday afternoon, as I was trimming the hedge by the front walk, I saw Sophie's SUV pull in again. She walked over with a paper bag from the local bakery. "Thought you might want some cinnamon rolls," she said, but her eyes flicked past me to the house. We sat on the porch and she brought up the property again, this time wrapped in concern. "You know, if you need help figuring out the legal stuff, Dad's friend works in real estate. He could check the deed for you, make sure everything's in order." I thanked her and said I already had it covered. Her smile tightened, and for a moment I thought she might press the point, but she just nodded and took another bite of her pastry. After she left, I stood in the doorway watching her car disappear down the road. The garden hummed with bees, the sun low enough to cast long shadows across the yard. I knew without a doubt she was looking for something, some hint that the place was vulnerable. But the papers were locked away 3 hours north in a fireproof drawer under a name she didn't know, protected by walls she couldn't imagine. All she could do here was look. And as long as she kept looking in the wrong place, I was safe. A low mist hung over the yard that morning, curling around the edges of the porch as I stood barefoot with a mug of tea. The quiet was still holding when the crunch of tires on gravel broke it apart. I set the mug down and walked to the front steps, my pulse tightening with each rotation of the tires. A black SUV rolled into the drive, followed by a smaller silver crossover. Both were crammed with boxes, duffel bags, and the unmistakable shape of plastic storage bins wedged behind the seats. Charles stepped out first, his heavy boots hitting the ground with purpose. Helen followed, her coat buttoned to the neck, clutching a clipboard like she was arriving for an inspection. Sophie emerged last, a sleek leather tote on her shoulder, her eyes sweeping the house without looking at me. They didn't come here to visit, they came to claim. I stayed where I was, letting them come to me. "We need to settle something today," Dad said, lifting an overstuffed manila envelope. I tilted my head. "Settle what exactly?" Sophie's voice cut through the cool air, brisk and final. "The house is in my name now. Papers are signed. We'll give you a week to get your things together." Behind her, the silver crossover was clearly loaded to move in, not out. Even a folded area rug was strapped across the back seat. My gaze returned to her face. She had rehearsed this moment, savoring it in her mind, imagining me scrambling. "Let me take a look," I said evenly, holding out my hand. Dad hesitated, then passed me the envelope. Inside were photocopies of property transfer forms, each one stamped with what was supposed to look like the county seal, but was faint and smudged. The signatures were off, the formatting wrong. To someone unfamiliar, they might seem convincing. To me, they were laughably poor forgeries. I flipped through slowly, buying time, studying their posture. Helen stood stiff, as if her authority could be worn like a coat. Charles had his hands on his hips, ready to push the point. Sophie was almost vibrating with anticipation. I stepped back into the house without another word and reached for my phone. My fingers moved quickly over the screen, finding the number I'd saved weeks ago. "Mark Henderson, Land Records Office." He answered on the second ring. "Mark, it's Natalie Green. I have a situation. Some people just showed up claiming ownership of my property. They're waiving paperwork I'm certain isn't real. Could you verify the official record and, if possible, stop by?" He asked for the address, then said he was already on a site visit nearby and could swing over. I hung up, took a breath, and stepped back outside. They were waiting exactly where I'd left them, the envelope now in Charles's grip again. "I've got someone coming who can clear this up," I said. 15 minutes later, a white SUV with the county seal pulled up, parking neatly beside Charles's vehicle. Mark climbed out, his folder tucked under one arm, a professional smile on his face. "Morning," he said to the group. He took the papers from Charles and glanced through them. "These aren't county-issued. The Lawson property is held in an irrevocable trust controlled by a registered LLC based in Seattle. That trust is legally protected. It cannot be transferred without the trustees' consent, and there has been no such consent." Helen's expression flickered, but Sophie's turned sharp. "Are you sure those records are current?" she asked, her tone biting. Mark didn't flinch. County property records update in real time. If there was a legal transfer, it would be reflected instantly. This he held up the photocopies is a forgery. And forging property documents is a criminal offense. The weight of his words landed with a dull thud. For a beat no one spoke. We're just trying to keep the house in the family, Helen said, finally, her voice taking on that brittle sweetness she used when she wanted to sound reasonable. It is in the family, I said, my tone level. Just not in your control. Charles's jaw tightened. He looked ready to argue, but Mark was already handing the forged papers back, closing the conversation with a polite nod. If you have any questions about proper transfer procedure, my office is open during business hours, he said before walking back to his vehicle. Sophie didn't move right away. She stared at me, a cold, measuring look, as if she could will me into explaining how I had blocked her. You're going to regret this, she said quietly, then turned on her heel and yanked her car door open. The two SUVs reversed down the driveway, their tires spitting gravel. I stayed on the porch, arms folded, watching until the curve of the road swallowed them whole. The air felt heavier in their absence, but also cleaner. I picked up the envelope they had left on the railing, now bent and creased. Inside, the forged documents were already curling at the edges. I carried them into the kitchen, dropped them into the bottom drawer where I kept useless things, and poured myself the tea I had abandoned earlier. Outside, the yard was settling back into its quiet rhythm. The gulls called from the shoreline, the wind rattled the leaves in the garden my grandfather had planted. Their attempt had been bold, and now they knew the door was locked. But people who feel entitled rarely stop at the first barrier. I sipped the tea, its heat steady in my hands, and listened to the sound of the tide beyond the trees. They would be back. And I would be ready. The envelope arrived on a Thursday morning, wedged halfway out of my mailbox, like it had been forced to fit. My name was typed in block letters on a cream-colored label, the return address a law firm in Tacoma I had never heard of. The weight of it told me it wasn't a casual letter. I slid my thumb under the flap, stepped inside the kitchen, and unfolded 3 pages thick with legal language and self-righteous demands. Helen's attorney wrote that my refusal to engage constructively with my family had caused her severe emotional distress, damage to her reputation in the community, and what he called ongoing mental anguish. For this, they demanded $150 zero-inch compensation, joint ownership of the Harborview property in Sophie's name alongside mine, and a monthly support stipend for Helen's living expenses. The letter concluded with a threat of litigation if I didn't comply within 14 days. I read it twice, my fingers tightening around the paper until it crinkled. This wasn't a plea or even a bluff. It was an attempt to rewrite the rules entirely, to force me into a corner where surrender might seem easier than a fight. They had underestimated how stubborn I could be. I scanned the signature line and noticed the notary seal at the bottom of an attached affidavit. The ink looked too clean, too crisp, like it had been dropped in from a digital file rather than stamped in person. A faint unease slid down my spine. I knew exactly who to call. Sonia Ramirez had been handling complex estate cases in Seattle for nearly 2 decades, the kind of attorney who didn't waste words and never confused sympathy with softness. When I arrived at her office that afternoon, she ushered me into a glass-walled conference room and waited until I had spread the letter across the table. She read in silence, tapping a pen lightly against her notebook. "They're overreaching," she said, finally, her tone measured. "And if I'm right about this notary seal, they're also lying. May I keep this for verification?" I nodded. "They want me to feel cornered. They want you rattled enough to give them something without a fight," she corrected, sliding the pages into a folder. "But if they've forged or misrepresented anything here, they've handed us leverage instead." Her first move was a cease and desist letter drafted and sent before I had even left her office. It was direct, almost surgical, instructing Helen and her attorney to immediately halt any demands or contact regarding the property or my finances under threat of legal action for harassment and fraud. Her second move was more discreet. She contacted the Washington State Department of Licensing to verify the notary commission listed on the affidavit. 2 days later, she called me with an edge of satisfaction in her voice. "There is no such notary registered in this state," she said. "And this commission number doesn't exist in any database." I also traced the filing of the original letters supporting documents. They were submitted through a third-party service based in Nevada. The listed applicant is your sister. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. So Sophie put her name on a fraudulent filing tied to this demand. That's exactly what it looks like, Sonia replied. And that gives us options. We can report this to the county prosecutor, file a civil claim for attempted fraud, or hold it quietly until we need it as bargaining power. Sometimes it's better to let them walk deeper into the trap. The thought of Sophie sitting in front of her laptop filling out false forms and thinking she had outsmarted me was almost surreal. I had spent weeks locking every door and window around the estate only to find her picking at the lock from another angle entirely. What do you recommend? I asked. For now, she said, we document everything secure, certified copies of every piece of evidence, and store them somewhere your family cannot reach. Keep living as though nothing has changed. They're expecting you to respond in anger or fear. Don't give them that satisfaction. I left her office with a slim binder containing duplicates of the forged documents, the non-existent notary details, and the Nevada service records. The binder felt heavier than it was, like it carried the shift in power I had been waiting for. That night, I placed it in the fireproof safe at my apartment alongside my trust paperwork and LLC records. The combination lock clicked into place, a sound that felt as final as it did protective. Through the window, the lights of the city blinked against the dark, steady, and unbothered. I knew Helen would read Sonia's letter and bristle. Sophie would deny involvement, and Charles would call it all a misunderstanding. But the truth was now mine to hold, documented and ready. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to think not just about defending what was mine, but about what I might do next. I had been reacting, holding my ground. Now, with proof in hand, I could decide when and where the next move would land. I poured a glass of water, set it on the counter, and looked at the binder one last time before turning off the lights. They had made the first overt strike. I intended to make the next one count. It started with a text from my cousin Megan late on a Sunday morning. She didn't usually reach out, and when she did, it was about neutral things like recipes or updates on her kids. This time her message was short and sharp. You need to hear this. She sent an audio file that played the moment I pressed it. Helen's voice came through flat and deliberate, speaking to what sounded like a room full of relatives. She told them I had manipulated our grandfather in his final months, convincing him to rewrite his will while he was too weak to understand. She said I had isolated him from the family, cut off their calls, and pushed away anyone who might question me. The way she framed it, I wasn't a granddaughter who inherited a trust. I was a thief who planned the whole thing. Megan's follow-up texts came quickly. This was at Aunt Linda's last night. She's been saying it to anyone who'll listen. And check this. Screenshots appeared on my screen, group messages from relatives I hadn't seen in years. Comments about me taking advantage, about greed, about how money changes people. A few were worse, speculating about how I'd bought off a lawyer to cover my tracks. I sat back, phone in my hand, feeling the weight of it press against my chest. This wasn't just a family argument anymore. It was a smear campaign designed to damage me in the one arena I couldn't ignore, the court of family opinion. When I called Sonia, I didn't need to explain much. She listened, then said quietly, if she's spreading false statements as fact, she's opening herself up to defamation. But before we talk about legal routes, we can control the narrative. By Monday afternoon, I was in her office with my laptop open, pulling up emails, documents, and photos. Sonia drafted a document she titled Statement of Facts. It was 12 pages long by the time we were done, laid out like a legal brief, but written in plain language. It started with a timeline of my grandfather's final year, supported by dated phone records showing I had visited or called regularly. It included his notarized statements from before his illness about wanting me to inherit the estate. It had copies of the trust and will, all signed and witnessed according to law. We attached scanned letters from his doctors confirming he had been mentally sound when the documents were executed. We even included photos from family gatherings in those months showing him smiling and engaged. Every single piece of it was sourced and verifiable. You don't have to be defensive, Sonia said as she flipped through the finished packet. You just present the facts the same way you would in a courtroom. Let them decide which version they believe, but make it impossible for the truth to be ignored. That night, I sent the statement of facts to every relative in my contact list. I wrote a short note explaining that recent rumors had been brought to my attention and that the attached document contained the complete factual account of my grandfather's estate and my role in it. I didn't mention Helen by name. I didn't need to. The responses began trickling in the next day. Aunt Linda wrote back a single line, "I didn't know all of this." My cousin Daniel called to apologize for repeating something he had heard at a barbecue. Others were cooler, sending polite acknowledgments without comment. And some, like Uncle Ray, replied with thinly veiled skepticism, saying they still had questions but would leave it in God's hands. Megan called me that evening. "You rattled them," she said. "I was at lunch with Mom and Helen today. Your name came up and Helen looked furious. She knows you've pulled her teeth on this one." I thanked her, though the truth was I didn't feel triumphant. This wasn't about winning an argument. It was about drawing a line against the erosion of my reputation, against the slow drip of poison into a network of people I'd grown up with. Still, part of me understood that I couldn't undo all of it. Some people would cling to Helen's version no matter what I showed them. Maybe they needed to believe it. Maybe it made their own disappointments easier to bear. But others had seen the proof, and that meant the lie would never be unanimous. I printed a hard copy of the statement and placed it in the safe alongside the binder of fraudulent filings. Piece by piece, I was building not just a defense, but a record. If this ever spilled into court, I would walk in with a wall of evidence she couldn't scale. Outside, rain had started again, tapping lightly against the windows. I stood there for a while, watching the streetlights blur through the drops, feeling the quiet resolve settle back in. Helen wanted a war of perception. I had chosen a war of facts, and now the facts were out in the open, ready to do their work. The call came just after 9 on a Thursday morning while I was reviewing a quarterly report. Paul McCarthy's name flashed on my phone, and the tone in his voice when I answered told me this wasn't about numbers. He asked if I could step into his office for a few minutes. I walked down the hallway, the familiar hum of printers and muted conversations in the background. Paul was standing by the window when I entered, hands in his pockets, looking out at the sound. He motioned for me to sit. He started carefully, as if weighing each word. He said he had received a phone call the day before from someone claiming to be a family member of mine. She had told him she was concerned about my character and wanted to make him aware of certain things before it became a problem for the company. The way Paul described it, Helen had made it sound like a civic duty cloaked in concern but dripping with accusation. I kept my face still even as I felt a slow burn in my chest. Paul went on repeating some of what she had said. She told him I had coerced my grandfather into changing his will, that I was under investigation, and that I had a history of financial recklessness that could embarrass the firm if it ever came to light. She even tossed in the idea that I was estranged from my parents for reasons she didn't feel comfortable sharing but implied were ugly. When he finished, I asked him directly if he believed any of it. He shook his head without hesitation. He said my work here had been flawless, my record spotless. But he also said that in his position he couldn't ignore a call like that without at least addressing it with me. I told him I appreciated the transparency, then pulled out my tablet. I showed him the statement of facts Sonia and I had compiled, including the notarized trust documents, the doctor's letters, and the dated phone logs. I explained that Helen and I had been in a dispute over my grandfather's estate and that her tactics had turned personal. I didn't sugarcoat it. Paul read through the key pages, leaning back in his chair. When he set the papers down, he looked me straight in the eye and said, "This doesn't change a thing about your standing here. If anything, it makes me respect you more for handling it head-on." The knot in my stomach loosened, but only a little. I knew how quickly rumors could travel, especially when they came dressed in just enough detail to feel credible. Paul might have dismissed it, but who else had Helen called? Later that day, while I was grabbing a coffee in the break room, I overheard two colleagues talking near the vending machine. They didn't notice me at first, and I caught enough to know they were discussing something going on in my family. When I stepped into view, they stopped mid-sentence, one of them mumbling something about a client call before leaving. By the time I drove home that evening, I had replayed the exchange in my head a dozen times. Harborview was small enough that news, true or false, tended to spill from one circle into another. If Helen was willing to call my boss, she wouldn't hesitate to reach out to others. Neighbors, community groups, maybe even local organizations I volunteered with. I stood in my kitchen looking out at the gray stretch of water beyond the trees. This was no longer confined to family dinners or group texts. She was trying to undercut my credibility in the one arena that mattered most to me, my professional life. I called Sonia that night and told her what had happened. She listened, then reminded me that every false statement Helen made to a third party was another piece of potential evidence. Keep a written record, she said. Dates, times, who she spoke to, what was said. If this keeps up, we'll have more than enough to escalate. After we hung up, I sat at the table and opened a fresh document on my laptop. I labeled it Incident Log and started from the beginning, noting the call to Paul, the details he shared, and the overheard conversation at work. It felt methodical, almost clinical, but there was a quiet power in turning her attacks into documented facts. The next morning, Paul stopped by my desk. He told me that he had already spoken with the HR department, making it clear that any calls or messages about me should be forwarded directly to him. He said he wouldn't tolerate harassment of his staff from family or anyone else. The gesture was more than I expected, and it steadied me. Still, as I drove through Harborview later that weekend to pick up supplies, I noticed a shift in how some people greeted me. A few waved like always. Others gave polite, distant nods. One woman I'd known since high school crossed to the other side of the street before I could reach her. It was subtle, but I felt it. The story Helen was selling had started to seep into the cracks of the community. It was no longer just about legal rights to an estate. It was about identity, about whether I was seen as trustworthy or suspect in the eyes of people who thought they knew me. I carried my bags inside, set them down on the counter, and took a long breath. The house felt steady around me, its quiet holding firm against the storm outside. Helen's move at work had failed, but the ripples were spreading. The next wave wouldn't just test my patience. It would test my footing in the place I had always called home. It started with glances in the grocery store aisle, the kind that lasted a beat too long before someone turned away. Then came the subtle shifts in conversation at the Harborview Cafe, where certain tables went quiet when I walked in, and others suddenly made room for me to sit. By the end of the week, it was obvious. The town had split. One afternoon, I was trimming back the rose bushes by the front walk when Edith Collins pulled her car into my driveway. She had been my neighbor since I first moved here, the kind of person who always brought over a pie at Thanksgiving without asking if you wanted one. She stepped out with a manila envelope tucked under her arm, looking over her shoulder before she came up the path. I offered her a glass of iced tea inside, but she shook her head and stayed by the door. She told me in a low voice that Helen had been making the rounds in town. Not just casual conversations, but actual visits to people's homes, talking about restoring fairness and doing what's right for the family. The pitch, according to Edith, ended with Helen handing over a petition for people to sign. My chest tightened. I asked what the petition said. Edith slipped the envelope into my hands. Inside was a single-page letter on plain white paper addressed to the residents of Harborview. It claimed that I had wrongfully taken sole possession of the Lawson estate and called for community support in demanding that I share a fair portion with my sister. At the bottom were more than 30 names and signatures. I scanned them quickly, recognizing neighbors, acquaintances, and even the owner of the hardware store. My eyes caught on one name in particular. It belonged to a woman I had spoken with just the day before, someone who had expressed nothing but support for me. I called Edith over to look. She leaned and pointed at the signature and said she was certain it was a fake. The handwriting didn't match, and the woman in question had told Edith she had refused to sign anything. Edith then confessed that she hadn't signed either, though her name appeared halfway down the page. The air seemed heavier as I set the paper on the counter. Forging signatures turned the situation from a smear campaign into something that could carry legal consequences. I asked Edith if she would be willing to make a statement about what she had told me. She didn't hesitate, only nodding and saying she would back me up however she could. After she left, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the petition. The names felt like a map of the divide running through Harborview. Some were people I knew would stand against me no matter what. Others were question marks, now their loyalties suddenly uncertain. And then there were the forgeries, proof that Helen was willing to cross into criminal territory to sway public opinion. I scanned the document into my laptop and sent the file to Sonia with a short note. We have signatures that appear to be forged, two confirmed by the individuals themselves. Need to discuss next steps. Within an hour, Sonia called me back. Her voice was calm, but I could hear the edge of focus in it. She said this was no longer just about defending my rights to the estate. If the signatures were falsified, that was fraud, plain and simple. Depending on how the petition was used, it could even rise to the level of attempted coercion. That night, I made a list of every name on the petition and began calling the ones I trusted most. Some were genuinely surprised to hear their names were listed. A few admitted they had signed after hearing Helen's version of events but were open to learning the truth. Others hung up quickly, their minds clearly made up. By the end of the calls, I had confirmed 4 more forged signatures. I wrote down every detail of each conversation, noting times and exact words. The pattern was undeniable. Helen wasn't just building a coalition of support, she was manufacturing it using fabricated consent to pressure me in front of the entire town. The next day, I met Edith at the cafe. She handed me a second envelope, this one holding a copy of a letter Helen had sent to the local paper. It hadn't been published yet, but the editor, an old friend of Edith's, thought I should see it. In it, Helen described the fracturing of family values in Harborview and framed herself as someone fighting for justice for her sister. The language was polished, almost political, but the undertone was clear. She wanted the community to see me as a greedy outsider in my own home. I folded the letter carefully and slid it back into the envelope. This was no longer a private feud bleeding into public spaces. It was a public campaign with the trappings of legitimacy designed to isolate me and erode whatever standing I had left in Harborview. As I walked back to my car, the autumn air felt sharper against my skin. I could see people talking in small clusters near the market, their glances flicking toward me. It wasn't paranoia. I had become a subject of discussion, a fixture in a story I hadn't chosen to tell but now had to live inside. That evening, I called Sonia again. I told her I wanted to move forward with whatever legal measures we could take to address the forged signatures. She said we would need sworn affidavits from those whose names had been falsified, and she would arrange for a notary to meet them discreetly. Once we had enough, we could decide whether to send a formal demand letter or go directly to the county prosecutor. I agreed, then hung up and sat in the quiet looking out at the darkening tree line. The house was still, the kind of stillness that felt protective rather than empty. But outside those walls, the lines were being drawn deeper into the ground. This wasn't just about property anymore. It was about credibility, legality, and the kind of damage that could outlast the truth. The next morning, I woke up with a clear sense of direction. The evidence against Sophie wasn't just about family drama anymore. It was professional misconduct tied to her license, and that was a world where feelings and personal narratives meant nothing. Rules either were followed or they weren't, and hers had been shattered in writing. I spent the better part of the day assembling every piece of documentation Sonia and I had gathered. The forged petition with confirmed false signatures. The fake notary seal. The transfer documents that never legally existed. Each file was labeled, scanned, and organized in a folder on my laptop. I printed hard copies and placed them in a binder thick enough to sit flat on its spine. By early afternoon, I was parked in front of my computer with the Horizons Land Realty Compliance Department's email page open. Their corporate site was polished, all warm colors and smiling agents shaking hands with new homeowners. But the compliance contact form was clinical, asking for specific violations, dates, and evidence. I typed carefully, laying out each point with references to the attached files. No personal attacks, no emotion. Just the facts and the documentation to back them. I hesitated for only a second before clicking send. 2 days later, I received an acknowledgement from their director of compliance. The email was short, almost cold in its efficiency, but it confirmed they were opening an internal investigation and would be contacting the Oregon Real Estate Agency. I knew enough to understand what that meant. If the licensing board got involved, Sophie's career wasn't just in trouble. It was hanging over a fire. Weeks passed and Harborview settled into the brittle quiet that comes before a storm. I kept my routines, tending the garden, working from my home office, and meeting Sonia to track the progress of the affidavits. Every so often, I'd see Sophie's SUV in town, parked outside the cafe or idling in front of Helen's house. She didn't look at me when we passed each other on Main Street. She kept her sunglasses on her jaw tight. One Thursday morning, Sonia called with an update. Horizons Land had completed their investigation and terminated Sophie's employment effective immediately. The letter cited violations of ethical and legal standards and noted that all findings had been referred to the state licensing board. I felt a sharp, clean satisfaction. This was the kind of consequence no rumor or twisted narrative could erase. The following week, I received a copy of the formal notice sent by the Oregon Real Estate Agency to Sophie. It outlined multiple counts of professional misconduct, including fraudulent misrepresentation of property ownership and falsification of notarized documents. It stated that the case was being forwarded to the Clatsop County District Attorney's Office for potential criminal charges. It wasn't until a Saturday afternoon while I was pruning the hydrangeas that the impact of it all came into sharp relief. A white sedan with county plates pulled into Helen's driveway across the street. Two plainclothes investigators stepped out, each carrying a folder. They knocked on her door, and though I couldn't hear the conversation, I could see Helen's expression change from confusion to something tight and defensive. Sophie appeared a few moments later, her hair pulled into a messy bun, eyes flicking toward my yard for the briefest second. One of the investigators handed her an envelope. She glanced at it, then back up at him, saying something short and clipped. He didn't answer. They turned and walked back to the car. The sedan pulled away slowly, leaving Sophie standing on the porch with the envelope in her hand. Helen came out to join her, but Sophie shook her head and stepped back inside, shutting the door firmly behind her. Later, Edith called to tell me that the envelope had been a formal notice of indictment. Fraudulent property transfer. Forgery of legal documents. 2 felony counts with an arraignment date set for the following month. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold beside me. The satisfaction was there, but it was tempered by a deep awareness of the weight this would carry. Criminal charges meant courtrooms, sworn testimony, and the possibility of prison. It also meant the family could no longer spin this as a misunderstanding or a personal dispute. The state had taken hold of the story now. I thought about the quiet arrogance Sophie had worn the day she stood in my driveway with a stack of false papers, certain she could force me out of my own home. I thought about the slow, deliberate work it had taken to get here, each step measured, documented, and lined up so that when the push came, it couldn't be undone. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the briny scent of the bay through the open window. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the creak of the old house settling around me. The game had changed. Whatever moves they made next would be in response, not attack. And for the first time in months, I felt the ground beneath me hold steady. It was 3 days later when the call came. Helen's number flashed on my phone, and for a moment I considered letting it ring out. But something told me this wasn't another ambush or accusation. I answered, my voice steady. She didn't waste time with small talk. Charles and she wanted to meet, she said. Not to argue, she added quickly, just to see if we can find a way to end all this. The words were clipped, but the edge I'd grown used to was missing. We met the next afternoon at the Harborview Cafe, the same place we had celebrated my college graduation years ago. The irony wasn't lost on me. They were already sitting when I arrived. Charles leaning forward with his hands clasped, Helen stirring her tea without looking up. Charles started. He spoke about how the situation had gotten out of hand, how the legal mess would look bad for everyone, and how perhaps we could make it all go away if we agreed to certain terms. Helen chimed in, suggesting that if I withdrew the complaints and stopped pressing the charges, we could keep things within the family. She framed it as an olive branch, but her tone carried the weight of an unspoken plea. I listened without interrupting, letting them lay out their version of a compromise. It came down to this: Sophie's career was gone and the criminal case was moving forward. They wanted me to help make it stop. In exchange, they'd agree to some form of shared arrangement over the estate. When they finally paused, I set my cup down and met their eyes in turn. I told them there was nothing to negotiate. The estate was no longer in any form they could access. It was protected by legal structures they couldn't dismantle, and even if they tried, it was no longer under my direct ownership. I explained that the assets had been moved months ago, placed in entities and accounts beyond their reach. There was no scenario where they could touch it now, even if I wanted them to. Helen's hand froze over her tea. Charles leaned back, his jaw tightening. For a moment, no one spoke. The clinking of cutlery from nearby tables felt almost intrusive in the stillness between us. Helen recovered first, her voice low but sharp. "You're really going to do this to your own family?" I didn't flinch. I reminded her of the months of forged papers, false signatures, and public lies. Of the driveway confrontation with Sophie, the smear campaigns, the harassment at my job. I told her that protecting what was entrusted to me wasn't an attack, it was a boundary they had refused to respect. Charles's eyes dropped to the table. When he spoke, his tone was flat. "Then there's nothing left to talk about." I nodded, stood, and left enough cash to cover my tea. Neither of them looked up as I walked away. That evening, the quiet in the house felt different. Not the tense stillness of waiting for the next blow, but the cold absence that follows when something finally breaks. The phone stayed silent. No emails. No unexpected knocks at the door. In the days that followed, I saw them in town only once. It was outside the post office. Helen was coming out as I was going in, and our eyes met for the briefest second. There was no glare, no smirk, just a blankness that was somehow heavier than hostility. Charles stood beside her, holding the door, his gaze fixed somewhere past me. Word traveled fast in Harborview. Edith mentioned that the family dinners at Helen's had grown smaller. Some relatives stopped showing up altogether. Others came, but the talk was cautious, the laughter forced. The once constant hum of their social orbit had thinned into something brittle. At home, I found myself tending to small repairs I had been putting off. Tightening a loose hinge, repainting the porch railing. The work was steady grounding. I no longer felt the need to glance over my shoulder every time a car slowed on the street. But beneath the quiet was an understanding I couldn't shake. The battle over the estate was over in every practical sense, but the damage it had done to the family would not heal. The warmth that had once been there, however fragile, had been replaced by a permanent frost. One afternoon, as I stacked split logs by the shed, a gust of wind carried the sound of gulls from the bay. It reminded me of the day I signed the trust documents sealing the estate away for good. That decision had started a chain of events neither of us could take back. By the time the sun dipped low behind the tree line, I knew with certainty there would be no more offers, no more attempts at reconciliation. Whatever thread had held us together had snapped clean, and none of us would try to tie it again. The weeks that followed carried a strange quiet, the kind that seeps into the edges of each day and changes the way you move through your own house. The calls stopped. The unexpected knocks on the door stopped. Even the gossip that had once found its way to me through friends in town seemed to fade, replaced by the low hum of ordinary life returning. By late September, the first hints of autumn were everywhere. The air along Harborview's Main Street had turned sharper, scented with wood smoke from the first fireplaces being lit. Maple leaves littered the sidewalks, their colors shifting from gold to a deep russet. I found myself lingering in town after errands, not because I was avoiding home, but because I no longer felt the need to rush back and guard it. The estate was beyond reach now, both physically and legally, and for the first time in months I could walk through the day without bracing for impact. One Friday afternoon, I packed a bag and drove toward the coast. The two-lane road wound through pine forests, the late sun flickering between the trees, as if the light itself was in no hurry. When the ocean came into view, it was as if I had crossed into another rhythm entirely. The beach house stood just as it always had, sturdy and weathered, with the scent of salt and cedar in the air. I let myself in and opened the windows to let the sea breeze move through. It carried the familiar briny tang that always made me think of my grandfather. I could almost picture him at the kitchen table shuffling a worn deck of cards or out in the yard trimming back the hedges with his old shears. I built a small fire in the hearth, the kind that doesn't roar but settles into a steady crackle. With a mug of tea in hand, I stepped out onto the back deck. The horizon was painted in bands of orange and rose, the waves rolling in with a rhythm older than anything we could fight over. Standing there, I thought about that last summer we spent here together. His voice had been softer by then, but the conviction in his words was unshaken. He had told me that what you value most will always draw eyes, and that sometimes the smartest thing you can do is make sure no one knows how close they are to it. At the time, I didn't understand the depth of what he meant. Now I did. Inside, I walked the room, slowly running my hand along the smooth wood of the banister, the edge of the kitchen counter, the frames of photographs that lined the hallway. There was one of him holding a fishing rod, another of me at 6 years old holding a seashell as if it were treasure. They weren't just pictures. They were proof of something unshakable, something worth defending beyond its market value. The legal documents that secured all of this were nowhere near here. They were locked away 3 hours north, in a fireproof drawer under a trust name. No one outside a select circle could connect to me. I had placed them there deliberately, building layers of protection that were invisible to anyone who might try to take them. That decision had been my final quiet move, the one that made every other attack meaningless. As darkness settled in, I lit a single lamp in the living room and sat with the quiet. It was not the tense, watchful silence I had lived in before, but a calm that came from knowing there was nothing left for them to reach. The disputes, the letters, the false claims, none of it had power anymore. In the morning, the sun broke across the water in a spill of gold. I took my coffee outside, the mug warm in my hands against the cool air. A pair of gulls circled overhead, their calls sharp against the sound of the surf. I thought of the months behind me, of how close I had come to losing not just the property but the peace it represented. Now both were intact. The trust remained untouched. The land, the house, the history bound to it, all of it was safe. I had kept my grandfather's promise to himself and to me that his legacy would stay whole no matter who tried to break it. I stood there for a long time, letting the wind thread through my hair, the waves filling the spaces where words would have been. There was no satisfaction in their loss, only in the preservation of what mattered most to me. Some people might have sought a final confrontation, a chance to lay out every wrong. I found more strength in knowing that I didn't need to. As the tide began to rise, I closed my eyes for a moment and listened. Somewhere inland, they might still be wondering. They might still be talking. They might even still be hoping for a way back into what they had tried so hard to take. But they would never find it. And they would never know where it truly was. Thank you for staying with me through this story. I would love to hear your thoughts and your own experiences about protecting what matters most, whether it is a place, a memory, or a hard-earned peace. Share your story in the comments so we can keep this conversation going.